Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Enlightenment That Failed, Ideas, Revolution, and Democratic Defeat, 1748 to 1830, by Jonathan I. Israel. Narrated by James Cameron Stewart. 1. Introduction. Radical Enlightenment and Modernity, 1650 to 1850. 1.1. Basic Argument and Scope. A quarter century after originally formulating my Radical Enlightenment thesis, this volume extends the project's core themes by reaching back before 1650 to consider the underground movements of the Radical Renaissance and Radical Reformation in relation to the Enlightenment, and forwards to encompass a range of relevant contexts thus far not covered or brought together, such as women's emancipation, black emancipation, race theory, the rise of the Spanish-American republics, education reform, law reform, and the advent of economics, and especially post-1789 revolutionary upheavals in the transatlantic world and the early 19th century. The volume also addresses key objections raised in the escalating controversy surrounding the thesis. In recent decades, an important response of the historiography to the growing need to reassess the overall Enlightenment phenomenon in both its unity and diversity, given the burgeoning wealth of detail research has made available, and the growing need also to adopt a much wider geographical perspective than was once usual, has been to reorganize the topic primarily in terms of plural enlightenments and focus increasingly on particular national and religious contexts. The core argument presented in Radical Enlightenment, 2001, and developed further in Enlightenment Contested, 2006, and Democratic Enlightenment, 2011, was that the Western Enlightenment as a whole resulted from a shared outpouring of basic new findings and ideas in philosophy, science, and general scholarship, especially concepts of a liberating, tolerationist, secularizing kind, bringing in its wake, during the latter half of the 18th century, numerous wide-ranging practical improvements. Consequently, basing one's view of the Enlightenment on a diverse family typology, though understandable as a reaction to the historiographical problems, weakens our sense of the Enlightenment's unity, universal pretensions, and cosmopolitan flavor, as well as near-global reach, and our sense of its continuing relevance to politics and society today. Greater awareness of the unifying threads of the unfolding Enlightenment seems no less essential than increasing responsiveness to the Enlightenment's geographical range and diversity. The new criteria and findings of science combined with post-Cartesian philosophy to generate a vast panorama of fresh, innovative spheres of intellectual interest ranging from law reform to economics, ethnology, and what today are called the social sciences. This led in turn to an explosion of schemes and projects of amelioration aspiring to raise the level of human well-being by improving society's institutions, education, and basic organization. If this was a shared transatlantic experience, while some of the welter of new ideas and reform projects were of a bold, far-reaching character, others were just adjustments to the prevailing status quo. Whereas some were so transformative in implications and effects as to threaten the entire framework of society, religion, and politics, others could be easily absorbed within existing social conditions and structures of authority. Hence, what is chiefly required, arguably, is not a family of enlightenments typology, but a carefully defined binary classification of ideas and reform projects into socially endorsing and socially oppositional blocks, differentiating those backed by state and church from those rejected. In this way, we can more adequately profile the overall scenario and understand the international Enlightenment's shared internal tensions and conflicts. Projects, intellectual and practical, aiming at improvements, inevitably divided into two basic kinds. Schemes conserving the main components of the existing Ancien Régime framework, established religious authority and social hierarchy based on aristocracy and monarchy especially, versus those challenging and potentially revolutionizing the existing foundations of society, culture, and education with wholly new forms of thought and practice. As the latter category, that of the radical enlighteners, was generally considered a threat to society and religion, and both their writings and activities remained comprehensively banned until 1789, they tended to detach themselves to an extent from the rest of the Enlightenment and society, forming clandestine networks of gatherings, organization, and book culture. Starting as a few minuscule groups, they evolved into a widely condemned underground intellectual sect, adopting clandestine practices to camouflage, publicly screen their challenging the beliefs, practices, and institutions of the then prevailing social and religious system. Growing from the 1660s down to the 1830s and 1840s, radical enlightenment, little by little, though never completely, divested itself of its early clandestine practices, but never its oppositional character. Some commentators assume the radical enlightenment category proposed encompasses all writers and thinkers rejecting the sway of theology and religious belief, but that is not the case. Many essentially irreligious Enlightenment thinkers, such as Voltaire, La Mettrie, Hume, Gibbon, and Goethe, abjured the religious assumptions of the past privately, but not the social hierarchy, principle of monarchy, traditional moral norms, at least for most people, and outward religious format, so that these too must be excluded from any meaningful radical category. Neither moderate nor radical enlightenment can in fact be satisfactorily defined in terms of religious or irreligious enlightenment. Unitarian, Arian, and other heterodox, free-thinking religious fringes existed, opposing church sway and conventionally accepted Christian theology, and inclined to embrace universal and equal rights, from whose ranks emerged several prominent radical enlighteners, like the great Welshman Richard Price, 1723–91. From the 1670s, for over a century, the most common nomenclature applied to these underground Enlightenment radicals, albeit rather less so in England and America than continental Europe, was to label them Spinozistes, as they were known in France. As we shall hear, there has been much dispute as to what significance, if any, should be attached to this nomenclature. But the important point for now is that although throughout the period from 1670 down to the 1830s, radical enlightenment generally had some, mostly indirect and tenuous connection with the actual philosophical and textual legacy of Spinoza, Spinoza had nothing to do with the existence of the radical tendency as such, which stemmed directly from the deep divisions in the Dutch Republic between Orangists and anti-Orangists in the third quarter of the 17th century. It was never part of the argument to claim the radical Enlightenment originated in Spinoza, as hostile commentators regularly misrepresent the argument. Claiming the radical Enlightenment thesis fails because it artificially imposes Spinoza's philosophy as a kind of package logic onto texts and thinkers, when some of these, like Condorcet, rarely if ever mention Spinoza and showed no direct sign of his influence, is distorting the debate with inapplicable objections. Radical Enlightenment here remains what it was in the earlier volumes, refusal of religious guidance of society on philosophical grounds, combined with universal principles rejecting aristocracy and monarchy in favour of representative, democratizing republicanism, nothing more nor less. After the third volume of the series, Democratic Enlightenment, 2011, appeared two specialized studies, Revolutionary Ideas, 2014, on the French Revolution, and The Expanding Blaze, 2017, on the American Revolution, requisite as preliminaries to this volume, especially to provide enough evidence and analysis of texts to substantiate overarching arguments relating to the revolutionary era and beyond, on which ultimately the entire radical Enlightenment thesis rests. The conclusions reached diverge from much of the previous historiography. Although the vast upheaval and turmoil of the French Revolution was chiefly due to the Crown's financial breakdown and mass movements of protest, the democratic republican orientation, direction, and legislation of 1789–93, these works argue, flowed principally from a vanguard of philosophical republicans who were actual or virtual republicans mixing in philosophique circles well before 1789, often among the coteries of Diderot, D'Holbach, and Helvetius. Also, from 1789, a much noisier, more public rift manifested itself among enlighteners than had existed earlier. Many enlighteners recoiled from the new democratic and secularist credo, aligning defensively with monarchy, church, and aristocracy against the democratic republicans, while others in many countries supported the revolution in its more democratic mode, embracing general will in its non-Rousseauist format, universal and equal rights, and egalitarian principles. Revolutionary turmoil inevitably sharply polarized and widely publicized enlighteners' splits, pushing them into two openly, soon violently opposed camps. While democratic republican secularizing groups plainly belonged to the radical Enlightenment category, powerful factions of constitutional royalists commanded another main thrust within the revolution, led by figures such as Mounier, Lally-Tollendal, Malouet, Maury, and Barnave, rejecting radical ideas and claiming the revolution must compromise with monarchy, aristocracy, and established religion, and are hence classified as heirs to the moderate Enlightenment. Moderate Enlighteners strove to steer between democratic Enlightenment and outright reaction, scorning the scorning of all enlightened change characterizing counter-Enlightenment. Hence, post-1789 moderate Enlighteners, including the French monarchiens Adams, Burke, Gibbon, and Ferguson, and even more, the post-1806 Prussian court reformers, still believed further reform, secularization, and rationalization were needed, up to a point, and should be carried further, whether on the basis of the mixed government British model derived from the Lockean revolution principles of 1688, or that of enlightened despotism, as under Napoleon's or Tsar Alexander I's rule. Revolutionary-era moderate enlighteners hence opposed both the radicals on one side and encroaching counter-enlightenment on the other. The education reformer Johann Ludwig Ewald, 1747–1822, writing in 1792, for example, urged Germany's princes fighting the democratic-republican challenge not to retreat into mere repression and rejection, but instead build on the Enlightenment of Frederick the Great, reigned 1740–86, and Joseph II, reigned 1780–90, restructure monarchy, and continue reforming their realms, but cautiously, always allied to ecclesiastical authority and Christianity. Under the 1814–15 Restoration, after Napoleon's final defeat, radicals and moderates came under renewed pressure from reactionary counter-Enlightenment, though frequently this had the opposite effect to that intended. In Ireland, Canada, and the United States, as well as Britain, what made the idealized radical Enlightenment vision appear even more inspirational and heroic to hardened political dissidents than it had before, as one scholar expressed it, was the violent resistance it met from British authorities. In Britain, this intensified climate of reactionary repression lasted 4 decades, from 1792 down to the Great Reform Bill of 1832. Both basic categories of Enlightenment, then, moderate and radical, are deemed revolutionary. The central role ascribed to both in the American, French, and other revolutions makes this a fundamental point. Both Enlightenment streams sought to curb despotism, reduce religious policing, enhance individual freedom, expand freedom of the press and expression, and generally ameliorate society by spreading enlightened ideas and expanding education. For all this, the transatlantic revolutions were indebted to the international Enlightenment as a whole. The core thesis regarding the French Revolution is that the two divergent streams, during 1787 to 93, both contributed to the making of the revolution, but became competing revolutionary ideological blocs within it, a struggle continuing until the Montagnard coup of June 1793. This brought to the fore a third force, one rhetorically appealing to, but at the same time vigorously repressing, the sans-culottes, using a dramatically different anti-intellectualist and in some respects more Rousseauist, essentially populist authoritarian counter-Enlightenment ideology. Fundamental to the radical Enlightenment throughout was that its democratizing republicanism was always focused on representative democracy. All radical Enlightenment theorists, from Spinoza to D'Holbach, Condorcet, Price, Volney, de Stewart, and Bentham, rejected pure, direct democracy, considering the common people of their time still too ignorant, superstitious, and prey to priestcraft to understand the issues, though they hoped, and some optimistically expected, this would change in the future. For democracy, as they understood it, to work, the common good, or general will, contrary to Rousseau's teaching, must be represented by responsible, aware, and well-educated spokesmen and delegates. Radical Enlightenment hence invariably opted for representative democracy, or, in its most sophisticated versions, as with Condorcet or the post-1810 Bentham, a complex balancing of representative and direct democracy backed by frequent re-election of representatives. Pure direct democracy, by contrast, the voice of the streets, Rousseau's dispensing with representation, radical thinkers down to 1848 invariably abjured as unenlightened and dangerous. Failing to see this, critics assuring readers the thesis collapses because key radical enlighteners like D'Holbach and Volney repudiated direct democracy, as indeed they did, are confusing the issue. What is sometimes called Robespierre's ultra-democratic project, direct popular sovereignty, was intrinsically alien to the radical Enlightenment creed, which remained relentless in stressing the ignorance of the multitude, albeit multitude understood not in terms of class, but in terms of ability or inability to understand the reality of things. In Spinoza and D'Holbach, this exacting standard by no means ruled out unprivileged, poor, and humble individuals who are perceptive and aware. But their multitude definitely did encompass most kings, princes, courtiers, aristocrats, professors, and clergymen who, radical enlighteners typically assumed, either failed to grasp or deliberately obfuscate the reality of things. Radical enlightenment was inherently and always entirely at odds with Rousseau's sublime science of simple souls. Another key argument about the revolutionary era, elaborated in The Expanding Blaze, is that until the Montagnard coup of June 1793, there existed enough basic parallels between the American and French revolutions, especially egalitarian concepts and universal and equal rights, to persuade leading radical publicists of the era, like Franklin, Price, Paine, Jefferson, Barlow, Mirabeau, Brissot, Condorcet, Volney, Cooper, and Priestley, and that the two revolutions' core principles were closely linked, or, as Paine expressed it, identical. Unlike former revolutions, which he dismissed as just a change of persons or an alteration of local circumstances, the American and French revolutions, for Enlightenment radicals either side of the Atlantic, together constituted a renovation of the natural order of things, a system of principles as universal as truth and the existence of man. American and French radicals, as democratic republicans, shared a common creed. When the Revolutionary American Congress convened in Philadelphia 1775-6, no privileged status of any kind was permitted or acknowledged. No social orders were separately represented, observed Condorcet in 1788, before the onset of the French Revolution, when, already firmly republican, he wished to justify excluding the French aristocracy from the future national legislature. Shutting the clergy altogether out of America's state constitutions, concurred Cerruti in 1788, was likewise a vital lesson for Europeans. The American Revolution's role in inspiring the ideological framing, and especially the universal and equal rights discourse and reformism of the French Revolution, was indeed basic. Unsurprisingly, given its centrality, radical enlightenment is no new concept. Since the 1920s, first introduced as a pivotal idea by Leo Strauss, the term has infused the historiography for almost a century, even if most historians and general readers only became aware of its importance from the 1970s. My own work seeks to extend the meaning and scope of this century-old concept. Many 18th-century political figures, often characterized in history books as radicals, but whose intellectual assumptions and arguments focused less on universal principles applying to all men deriving from natural right or natural rights, and more on long-standing constitutional traditions and precedents, real or alleged, particular to their own country, are excluded from the category as employed here. Such figures may have been radical in local contexts, but were not enlighteners promoting general radical principles internationally. Thus, many 18th-century British and American figures, often referred to as radicals, are excluded because in their pamphlets, speeches, and publicity they relied primarily on localized, particularist, constitutionalist arguments and played little part in international Enlightenment debates or drawing the connection between political radicalism and rejecting religious authority. The main constituent claims, or sub-theses, underpinning the overall argument down to democratic Enlightenment, 2011, were the initiating role in the 1660s and 1670s of the cercle spinoziste, the earliest intellectual ferment combining rejection of religious authority with democratic republicanism. Second, the amplifying role of Huguenot and other French intellectuals around 1700 in disseminating Spinozistic ideas, projecting the now Europe-wide clash between the moderation of Lockean Enlightenment dualism and radical one-substance monism. Third, the mediating intermediary role of the English deists, especially Toland, Tyndall, and Collins. Fourth, the war between opposing Enlightenment factions between 1756 and 1765 over whether or not the Encyclopédie was so subversive of monarchy as well as religion that it should be banned. Fifth, the public rift with which Voltaire became intensely preoccupied in the last decade of his life, what he called the guerre civile, civil war, dividing the French enlighteners, with one wing assailing the alleged alliance of kings and priests, and Voltaire and his following insisting on focusing on priests alone. Especially the cercle Spinoziste theme and second and third subtheses diverge from Margaret Jacobs' rival thesis that the first stirrings of the radicals of the Enlightenment, subscribing to what she calls a pantheistic conception of the universe, occurred in England after the Revolution of 1688-9. Following on from the aforementioned points, this volume brings into the picture the extension of the basic rift into new areas, especially women's emancipation, race theory, and black emancipation, the parallel profiles of the French and American revolutions until June 1793, Robespierrism as a populist counter-enlightenment to which all veritable radical enlighteners were adamantly opposed, continuation of the basic Enlightenment rift after 1815 through the 1820s revolutions, and, lastly, the argument that a growing rift arose between socialism and radical enlightenment in the 1830s and 1840s, friction that, among much else, led to Karl Marx's conversion from a radical Enlightenment outlook to his post-1844 economics-based socialism. 1.2 Definitions and Categories. The incipient radical Enlightenment of the 1660s and 1670s, the philosophically revolutionary phenomenon seeking to sweep all before it, commencing among the cercle Spinoziste in Holland, emerged against a backcloth of a much older and wider dissident fringe. It stood out from a long-standing mix of Epicureans, skeptics, libertins érudits, anti-establishment eclectics, alienated types, and philosophical and political rebels, a milieu fertilized by texts scholars today label clandestina, that is, clandestine manuscripts occasionally supplemented by anonymous and illicitly printed texts promoting intellectual traditions and structures of thought condemned, banned, and severely repressed by state and church. By contrast, the new tendency commencing in the 1660s and 1670s had a much tighter inner philosophical coherence and more dynamic conception of the relationship between forbidden thought and action. But assuredly it fed on the now long-established older clandestine milieu of furtive copying and discussion of forbidden subversive texts, primarily in Latin and French, and clandestine networking. Diffusing slowly from the 17th century's third quarter onwards, radical Enlightenment's illicit spread was aided by the older intellectual substratum of forbidden philosophy, which had long nurtured a tenacious, carefully masked, underground social structure with its own hierarchies, practices, and contacts, often built around under-the-counter booksellers and elusive printers. Simultaneously a social, cultural, and intellectual phenomenon, radical Enlightenment forged a new, separate intellectual identity, fundamentally rewriting the relation between thought and action, while diffusing, organizing, and expanding amidst a complex, diverse milieu of rival clandestine philosophical agendas